Michigan fans, are you still pinching yourselves? It's on to the national championship game against Washington. Two undefeated teams at 14-0. I'd really have to start thinking back, going through the years to figure out. I haven't looked it up, but when the last time that's happened? It's been a little while. We got Nelson Hubble here from Maize and Blue Review, breaking down Michigan football for us. So, Nelson, this is the first time we've talked to you since the big win at the college football playoff semifinal. So you're obviously amped.
Yeah, that was a pretty impressive win, by Michigan there late in the game. You see the struggles in that third quarter, and then they're able to make that comeback and then win it in OT. So, it felt like the better team won, although it took overtime to get there. A lot of those struggles, the muff punts and miscues on special teams, which, to be fair, I've been saying all season that special teams was a concern of mine. Mark, you might remember that. And it hasn't proved to be true until this point. The punting game was, really struggling. The field goal unit obviously missed a field goal and then had that botched snap for an extra point. And then you have those two muff punts. And so Michigan's going to look, throughout the week here to shore some of that stuff up. And I think part of that is the nerves and the stage and playing in the Rose Bowl. Maybe the scene of it all was a little big for some of those players to settle into, but Michigan did settle in, and they won in a pretty impressive fashion late, especially early as well.
What can you imagine to be the picture in your mind 20 years from now, thinking back on that game?
I think the picture is the sunset at the Rose Bowl, but also that touchdown run from Blake Corum. And probably that catch from Roman Wilson. Those are the two things that will immediately pop into your head. That catch that put them in position to score at the end of the fourth quarter, and then obviously that run by Blake Corum to win it. The botched snap at the end, with Milroe taking the draw rather than trying to hit the swing pass or any of his receivers that were out. I think there were only 3 receivers that actually ran routes on that play. That's something that you'll think about maybe third, fourth, fifth. But, the scene of Michigan getting that massive touchdown run from Blake Corum is probably the one thing that I'm going to, look back on every time I think about that game 20 years down the line. And there's always a play like that in big games.
Now, of course, Bama fans will say that differently. They'll think of the Milroe play and the final play as, number one. We had our Bama guy on here the other day, and I always enjoy my perspective in these games because I get to hear it from both sides. And I obviously just watched the game with no pressure, just enjoyed the game, kicked back, didn't care who won. And so then I kind of filter through all if Michigan blows this game and they lose, they can point to all this litany of much of what you pointed out. If Bama loses, they can point to, and sure enough, of course, when we had our guy Stephen M. Smith on here, he was like, they would have done this, they would have done that, they would have done this, they would have done that. They came that close here and that close there. So game went to overtime. Obviously, the two teams were pretty dead even, although, like you say, Michigan dominated the first half. Dominate might be a little bit aggressive of a word, but they controlled it. They were the better team significantly. And then the second half, of course, the defense did a nice job. Maybe the pass rush wasn't nearly as overwhelming as Bama maybe figured some things out up front. But the offense just kind of went away. At one point late in the game, I think before the final drive in regulation, I looked at the total yardage, and Michigan had about 45 yards of total offense going into the final drive. So obviously, I got to think as we spring forward, that probably can't happen against Washington. Probably.
No, you're totally right. That cannot happen against Washington. I do think Michigan's defense poses a test that Washington hasn't seen this year, obviously, as just about any team that plays Michigan's defense has had to face that. But Michigan's offense is still going to have to be efficient and do what for the most of the year they've been able to do and what they did for a portion of that game, especially in the first half against Alabama. They had those two scoring drives to put up 13 points after giving up that score to Alabama. And Michigan's offense looked exactly like we knew it to be. They took their time to get downfield. Now, they had that big touchdown pass, semi-big, to Tyler Morris, about 20-plus yards, but other than that, Michigan's offense looked like we sort of are used to. and they were able to lean on that consistency on offense and the play of their defense. So, looking ahead to Washington, I think Michigan's going to have to be able to score more points, but I also think their defense poses a threat that will help them big time in a game where that offense obviously is playing at its peak, especially Michael Penix is.
I talk to enough casual college football fans, but I got to think that most of the people I talk to are ardent, hardcore college football fans. And I still think that they tend to, not necessarily with this matchup, we will find out in the next few days as I talk, have more call-in shows, talk to more people, but tend to be impressed by offense and think that that's going to win it because it looks more impressive. It's more fun.
Yeah.
Here are two teams in Alabama and Michigan that scored 40 points total in regulation. The
Mm-hmm.
other two teams scored 68 and were a couple of yards away from scoring 75 in regulation, so
Mm-hmm.
almost twice as many points. However, I tend to lean on the defense and the sturdier play up front. Michigan certainly has that. Texas didn't give up rushing yardage. They're one of the top rush defenses in the country. I just can't believe that in that place that they were at in not giving up rushing yardage, being able to pin their ears back, that Washington's pass pro was that strong. They did win the Joe Moore Award
Mm-hmm.
to protect Michael Penix. And all kudos to Michael Penix. He's phenomenal. He was basically dropping Pat Mahomes, Aaron Rodgers kind of
Mm-hmm.
placement 40 yards downfield. However, he was standing there patting the ball most of the time. He had nothing to contend with. And I think that's going to be truly a different coming up on Monday night.
I think you're right. I think I tweeted this out probably it was somewhere during the season. And I tweeted out something, along the lines of Washington's offensive line, their interior, their left guard, center, and right guard, interior of their offensive line is 15 pounds lighter than the interior of Michigan's defensive line, and the starting players. And, the big one here for me is starting center Parker Brailsford, who's a redshirt freshman for Washington, who was second team all conference, freshman all American, and he is 275 pounds. So think about it like this. He's going to be going up against Kenneth Grant. That's sort of the nose tackle player for Michigan, who is 339 pounds. And I know Brailsford's been very good this season, but things like that matter. And Grant has also been pretty good this year. So things like that do matter, and size, the differential there also matters a lot. And so I'm curious to see what sort of pass rush Michigan will get up the pocket rather than from their blitz packages like they did against Alabama. Because, like you mentioned as well, this is a Joe Moore Award winning offensive line. They're a very good offensive line, and their tackle play has been good, which has helped keep Penix clean. So I think the interior of Michigan's defensive line is going to be very crucial, obviously stopping the run, but I think pushing the pocket in the pass rush and getting Penix out of the pocket and making him make plays on the move, which he's showed he's capable of. But it's not as easy as you're sitting there, like you said, patting the ball, just waiting for Rome Odunze to get open and just launch it, or Jalen McMillan, who's got great speed, or Jalen Polk, or any of those guys, and even Bernard, good receiver. So it should be interesting to see how that plays out. But I do think Michigan has a little bit of an advantage on the interior.
And the other portion in that is that while the game of football, especially in the modern day, is structured that decent receivers beat good corners, good receivers beat great corners. It's
Mm-hmm.
just structured in a way it's impossible to follow these guys around for 5 seconds. But that said, there will be plays where Will Johnson and Mike Sandristil will definitely be shoulder to shoulder with those
Mm-hmm.
guys and completely take them away, regardless of how long Penix stands back there. They're that good. Now, they can't be expected without a pass rush to do that all night,
Right.
but they can do that more than any other duo outside of, again, as we talked about the Alabama matchup going into that game, I was rating those two cornerback tandems to be basically the two best in the country. So they're as good or better than anybody in the country. So they will also help that pass rush because they're just that good in coverage. And I know Josh Wallace is coming around. He's played well. They're just airtight back there.
The safety play has been the big spot for me for Michigan. because they have four safeties. Quentin Johnson sometimes plays, slot corner, but he's started to come on late in the season. So you have Quentin Johnson as a depth piece, Keon Sabb in there, McCarthy Page, and obviously Rod Moore. Don't want to forget about him. So Michigan really can go with any different set of looks that they want. If they want to go light in the box and bring in an extra safety, bring McCarthy Page down, bring Keon Sabb down, and take a linebacker out, you can do that. And I think the formula for beating Washington is not the same, but going to be very similar to what it was to beating Ohio State in 21 or 22 because of the quarterback play being at that level and the receiver play being at that level.
No, that's a great comparison right there. And I've already been asked that 15 times. Who's better, CJ Stroud or Michael Penix, those Ohio State receivers or those Washington receivers? And the answer is, well, Stroud has proven it in the NFL. So for right now, you're going to take Stroud. But at that point in his career, who knows? They're all really, really good elite. Mm-hmm. So that's the answer. Keon Sabb late in that game made one of the big hits in the open field against a Bama receiver. Yep. And the other thing I get to, and I try to hesitate on this because I don't want to play the Big Ten's bigger and tougher and stronger than any other conference. However, I will say that going down through history, recent history, that when the athleticism is fairly equal, I do think that teams are built differently in the Big Ten. And not that the guys are tougher or have any more determination, but they just have played a different style of football. And as you mentioned, the weight differences up front, that matters, especially in the fourth quarter.
It does, and especially for a center who might be getting worked over all game. And if he holds his own, like you're saying, throughout a good portion of the game, eventually that chip is gonna fall. And so, you can't place all of the, the onus of the game on one player. Obviously, it's an interesting matchup to look for. Last week, I'm not sure if I mentioned it on here, but I did my story for three Bama players to watch going into the game, and one of them was Seth McLaughlin, the center for Alabama, and for that reason, he struggled this year. And he's going up against a really good interior defensive line, and I don't know if that had something to do with his snap issues, which, like I mentioned, had been an issue for portions of the year, or not. But really, it showed to be a key factor in the game. And I think Brailsford is a better center than McLaughlin is, who's visiting Ohio State here. He's in the transfer portal now. But it's still interesting to see because, like I mentioned, that does have a serious impact on the game. That's one of the most underrated positions on the field, I think.
Now, Nelson, how many smiles are you putting on Wolverine fans' faces when you mention all the issues that McLaughlin had the other night and then mention that he's visiting Ohio State?
Oh, it's too many. It was one of those things where, you get the report that he's visiting Ohio State. No way. It can't be. Like this soon after the game, and a lot of Michigan fans are really rooting for him to go there. I also think he is, a solid center, blocking, run blocking, pass blocking. Obviously struggled there with the snap issue, but if you can figure that out, I don't really hold much stock in that carrying over to a new season.
Yeah, it's kind of like having the yips as a second baseman with an easy throw to first base. There have been really good second basemen that for a 20-year career, they were fine, but for one season, it just escaped them. What's remarkable to me, and I posted this in a video the other day talking about Schembechler, Harbaugh as a protege, and now Harbaugh has a chance to eclipse him with a national championship, and went through the history of Michigan football, where it was 3 years ago, what Harbaugh's been able to do here with, staying with what he believes in, but tweaking it at the same time. And that's really, I think, the mark of a great leader when you have core values that never change, but you're able to diagnose situations and change them in the moment and do the things that are required. But the Ohio State portion of this is back. You got to go back before my existence and my time watching football, when one of the two programs has surpassed the other. It has always been because that other program declined. Ohio State's still winning 11 games a year. They haven't declined. Maybe they've declined that much. They're going 11-1 basically every year. Michigan, that's what makes their ascension so remarkable. They're not taking advantage of a program that's dropped to 8-4. They are still eclipsing one of the 3 or 4 best programs in the country with what
Mhm.
they've done the last 3 years.
Yeah, you're right. And I think one of the guys that Michigan fans definitely appreciate, but maybe the country doesn't hear enough about is Ben Herbert. And when Michigan brought him in, the changes that made developmentally, I mean, the recruiting for Michigan has maybe not been as good as it was in the first few years of the Harbaugh tenure, but that's to be expected. Things have sort of leveled out since uh, the shine of a new coach, especially someone with a big of his name, comes in. But you get to now and you're looking at the strength and conditioning program for Michigan and having a strength coach like Ben Herbert. He started out, I think his career started at Wisconsin, then he went down to Arkansas, and then Michigan hired him. And the difference has been incredible. And I think there's Michigan's talked so much about building a culture and maybe fixing cultural issues after that 2020 season. And Herbert is, bar none, maybe one of the most, besides Jim Harbaugh, probably the most important person in fixing that cultural issue. And so then, like you're saying, you're looking at how they're playing, and they're going up against Ohio State, who's a great program. Those little things, it seems like Michigan has an advantage of. That's being the difference. And here it's culminating in a year where you have tons of experience, you have some great athletes, some great players, and then the culture's there. And so now you're coming into a game against Washington where this team, this is all they've wanted for now. This is their third year, chasing that. They've been this close, so close to getting that national championship. And they have that opportunity, and they've beaten up on Ohio State 3 straight seasons, as you've mentioned. And now it's time for them to sort of make that final click for them, which is winning the national championship. And then you look ahead at the Big Ten, and that's a whole different story, is the trajectory of all these programs. All the major teams in the Big Ten, except for Penn State, are losing their starting quarterback. That includes Oregon, USC, Washington, Michigan, most likely, and then Ohio State, right? So the landscape is still wide open next year, which is going to be fascinating to see.
The strength and conditioning is interesting as well because we had a guest on a couple weeks ago on the Miami channel connected to a college football strength and conditioning coach. And I went through a podcast where they were talking about, I think maybe some people lose sight, I'll include myself because I'm not down here talking strength and conditioning every day, of how complicated that is. It's not simply, we want the strongest offensive line, we're going to lift the most weights. There have been studies done that, yes, being strong is very important, but it hits a threshold where it doesn't matter anymore. Going to the NFL is not dependent on you squatting 550 instead of 480. It just, there's a threshold there. And then it becomes about all these measurements about explosion in the first like half a second or even less than that. And all these dynamics with leverage. And it's very interesting. And so it's not just simply, get a strength and conditioning coach that's going to make these guys lift harder, try harder. No, it's a whole science to it.
It is, yeah, and the nutrition program as well. Michigan made some changes there in the more recent memory, and that seems to have made a difference. And those little things matter in college football, in the NFL. The NFL knows it better than anybody else. Now that stuff is starting to get into college football more in the last 10, 15 years than it ever has. But yeah, strength and conditioning, nutrition, those things are program changing things. Obviously, you have to have the coach there, a coach like Harbaugh, Saban at Alabama, who's been doing those sorts of things for a while now, Georgia with Kirby Smart. But, you look at what Michigan's doing, and there's some logical reasons for this improvement, very logical reasons. It's not just they've just suddenly got better players and their coaching staff, which I would say is better than it has been at any point. There was a point there to be made after the 2020 season to bring in new guys, and they've made the right hires with Minter, obviously, after McDonald went back to the NFL. And by the way, Mike McDonald at Baltimore is having one of the best seasons for a defensive coordinator in the league. So, they're making the right hires and they're doing the right things that give you those little advantages, and that's why we see them here now in a 14-0 football team playing another 14-0 for the national championship. And what more could you want as a college football fan?
Yes, we post the line there. Michigan opened as a 4.5-point favorite. Vegas proves once again that they kind of know what they're doing. They basically said Michigan's that much better, and they were that much better. and they beat Alabama. While there were a number of us, I'll include myself, that was like, I'm tossing these two teams in the air, and I'm going to rely on Alabama's history. I'm going to rely on Saban preparing a team. And that's what it came down to for me, because I couldn't separate the two teams. So there we go. Michigan's able to get it done. What's also interesting is we go back 3 years, or in this case, technically about 2.5 years. The last time these two teams got on the field together, who would have envisioned? Because this is at a point where Michigan's coming off 2-4. What are they going to do? I looked at the box score a few minutes ago, because I'm going to post a series, or I'm going to post a video on these series between these two schools. Blake Corum runs for 171, Hassan Haskins for 155, Cade McNamara is throwing for 44 yards. It's Michigan doing what Michigan does best, and especially at that point, taking on a Washington program that just went from Chris Peterson's stability to they were in shambles. And who would have thought 2 years later, Kalen DeBoer resurrects this program, and they're playing in a national championship game.
Yeah, I mean, I was at that game, and that was not my thought for even a second while I was sitting there watching it. I'm enjoying the game, and I'm watching Michigan.
Yes, if somebody would have said to you, sorry to interrupt, Nelson, these two teams are playing in the national championship game in 2 years.
No chance.
That's
no
just
chance.
crazy.
Where they were at program-wise, it just made no. I would have told them that they were crazy. And then you look at who was starting at quarterback in that game for Washington, Dylan Morris. He's still on the roster.
Yep.
I think he has another year of eligibility left. He's technically a junior this year, I think, but he's been playing since 2020. So I think he has another year or two of eligibility. So I doubt he wins the job next year. Frankly, I expect Washington to have somebody else. Morris didn't look impressive in that game.
I know they brought in Will Rogers from Mississippi State.
That's right. So we'll see what happens. But yeah, that was not anything remotely close to what I would have expected, even throughout the course of that season, until you got about to that Michigan State game, or maybe a little bit before that. I wouldn't have thought that Michigan would have been able to sustain what they were doing, but here we are, and it's come Monday night at 7:30 on the Four Letter Network. We'll see what happens.
So this is all focused on Penix and Michigan's ability to stop those receivers, and we've gone through all of that. Maybe Michigan's toughness, sturdiness, defense, and then, of course, J.J. McCarthy is making his mark as the greatest quarterback in the history of the program, and I think that's a valid statement by Jim Harbaugh.
Yeah, I mean, it is, and that's going to be. You talk about legacy-defining moments for players, and obviously that drive for McCarthy at the end of that Alabama game in the fourth quarter to get them down the field, making every right play. It was very well schemed up as well, but he hit his guys, and he did what he had to do, made that throw to Roman Wilson, which had it not gotten tipped, it probably would have gotten there, but it got tipped anyways and still somehow got there. You look at that replay and somehow the ball continues its trajectory just a little bit higher. Usually when it tips, it flutters a little bit, right? So, he was able to make those plays, and now you come into a game against a quarterback who, for, people were sort of saying was in the Heisman conversation with McCarthy. Obviously, Penix was, very debatable, in my opinion, with Jaden Daniels. But, McCarthy was lingering there until those final 4 or 5 weeks of the year where he got hurt and then played some better defenses. But McCarthy has his chance now to really make a mark. I mean, he won the Rose Bowl, was able to have that drive, which was I would say, a legacy-defining moment. But here to add to it, right, in the national championship game against a quarterback who everyone is saying is far and away better than you, which I would say is definitely better than McCarthy. Michigan's also not asking him to do as much either. But I don't think that's a fair thing to say that McCarthy would be even remotely better. But Penix is a better quarterback, and that's what people are saying, and you're hearing that as a player, and you have a chance here to make that legacy-defining moment or game. And what stage could you ask for other than the national championship, except for maybe the game against Ohio State? That's second.
Yeah, it's kind of a different category.
Yeah.
Why is there some kind of debate between McCarthy and Brady? They're just completely different conversations. Tom Brady's the greatest quarterback of all time, but he played a 20-some-year NFL career, and you can't compare that portion of it. But just at Michigan, Brady accomplished really nice things, capped it off with a big Orange Bowl win against Alabama, had a nice career, emerged through a quarterback battle, did great things that now we look back on as the making of history and setting him up for legendary things at the NFL level. But what McCarthy's doing far surpasses that. And then he's got 20 years to figure out whether he can chase Brady. And that's ridiculous to expect that of anybody, to do what Tom Brady did in the NFL, 10 Super Bowls. That's just
Yeah, I
crazy.
mean, you look at it and I hate the conversation. It's very clear to me, Michigan fans, that's their guy. So they're obviously going to want to make those comparisons. Tom Brady is, the one especially for as long as Michigan was struggling. Was the one guy that could point his success in the NFL peaked around the time that Michigan was really struggling. So they were sort of able to point like, hey, well, we got Tom Brady, the greatest quarterback of all time. But that's the NFL, right? And you said that what McCarthy's done in college is not even close to what Brady did in college. He's just a better quarterback, and that's simple. And if he was to come back for his senior year, we'd see that, maybe even more so. Which I'm still not sure about McCarthy, to be honest. I don't think it's too cut and dry if he comes back or not. But Harbaugh likes to make that comparison. I think he's trying to build his guy up and say, hey, you're doing better than what Brady did. Look what you can do if you get to the league. And it's not a worthwhile conversation for me because like you mentioned, it's just not even it's kind of ridiculous to make that comparison at the collegiate level, and then obviously it has all that time in the NFL and success, which is where most of Brady's major success came from. He didn't win a national championship. So if McCarthy were to do that, he'd further cement himself as the best Michigan quarterback of all time if he is able to win the Natty. But we'll wait and see. I don't comparison, can make people look silly sometimes. So I try to avoid those sorts of comparisons. I like to keep like comparisons, but it's going to happen at Michigan. That's just what happens.
Is there anything in this matchup that maybe people are missing that is important to you that might be under the radar?
I think it's the ball control style of offense for Michigan. And you mentioned with Texas, they weren't able to run the ball against Texas. Washington wasn't. So Dylan Johnson gets hurt at the end of that game. Supposedly he's going to play. He's sort of expected to play. And I don't think it's going to be easy for, Washington to run the ball at all. And I think it might, probably be just as difficult. So then you compare, the pass defense, what Michigan has versus what Texas has, and the score, and you look at it and you think to yourself, well, Michigan's the better team here. And obviously Texas's offense has had more explosiveness. But like I mentioned, that ball control style, the ability to keep the ball out of the other team's quarterback's hands, and the formula, as I mentioned earlier, is there. They've beaten, Ohio State doing that. So Penix, I think, will be a difference maker in this game. I think it'll be really close. But I just lean Michigan because that style, my perceived inability for Washington to run the ball and Michigan's ability to run the ball, and I think their offensive line is going to be really fired up, and I think maybe that's the component you're looking for here. Is Michigan's offensive line, Joe Moore Award 2 years in a row. Okay, a lot of these guys returned, brought in a couple transfers. I think they're fired up, man. I think against Alabama they looked to play really well. They had a good game there, especially in pass pro. But I really think that's the sort of component there. Is Michigan's offensive line is looking across the field at Washington and saying, hey, that could have been our award this year. They underperformed, in my opinion, this season, did Michigan. And so that's where you can see that difference being made is, do they, are they as fired up as I think they are? And is that a component that really changes this game? And I think it will. And I think Michigan wins close. If you want me to give you a prediction, I can give you one.
Oh, I'll always take a prediction.
All right.
Yeah, heck yeah.
Yeah, so my leaning on this game is I think Michigan wins 34-31. I think it's a little bit more high scoring. I think there are a couple turnovers. I think Penix throws a pick. I think Michigan turns it over once or twice. Maybe a fumble here or there from Washington. I think across the board looks pretty even in that category. Penalties, both very disciplined teams. So I think, Washington will probably stay away from getting penalized. Now, the difference is going to be that secondary for Washington, and can Michigan exploit it? I do think they will enough. And like I mentioned, that ball control offense, I think they're able to get downfield with enough regularity against Washington to get a couple field goals on top of those 4 touchdowns and 6 scoring drives. And I think Washington just has just enough, or Michigan has just enough on defense to slow down Washington to keep them. So I think that late field goal, or maybe Michigan's down 27-31, late touchdown takes that lead 34-31. I think that's where we end up.
And the look of the game, meaning the playing surface, indoors, all of that is basically a copy of what we saw Washington and Texas, and that's a good thing for Washington.
Yeah, probably. I would say offensively, whenever you see a high-powered offense, they want, the indoors and the sort of, level playing field there where the weather, isn't a factor. The Rose Bowl, I mean, same sort of deal. It was outside, but, there was no, weather issue. There was, if you wanted to say the sun, but beyond that, yeah. So I think that does favor Washington, and I still think, I've gone both ways on this because I don't think the line at 4.5 for Michigan. I think it's a little much, and so I'm leaning the 3-point, alternate spread. If you're someone who bets, I don't bet it because this is my job, and I find that to be like a little bit morally conflicting. But if you're someone who bets or you look at those sorts of things, because there's tons of calculations that Vegas does to get to their numbers. And I think Michigan -3 or looking as a 3-point favorite one way or another, how they get there. That's where I'm at. I could see 31-28. I could see 35-38 or something in that realm. But I do think Michigan comes up on special teams, figuring that out a little bit and not making the same mistakes that they did and playing the style of football that wins them games, that has won them games in the past.
And the winner or the loser in regards to the betting game is just kind of a roll of the dice in that Vegas is looking at numbers over the course of time, and they're looking at simulations that if you played this game a million times and all of that, they are playing the long game, and people that do this for a living are playing the long game. And so, for example, sharp money would tell you that actually people that put money on Bama made a smart play because they went tied into regulation. They lost the game, so that sounds stupid, but that if you're playing these games over and over and over and over, that was a smart play to make, as it resulted, because it was a Bama lead in the fourth quarter and they went to overtime. So yeah, you could have a tie game with 3 seconds left in the game and somebody breaks free for a touchdown and somebody wins by 7, and whomever believed that the other team was going to win, well, they had the game tracked pretty well. It just broke the wrong way. Anything less than a touchdown, especially on a point spread, can be very difficult to negotiate in, again, one play. If you do it over
my
time,
predictions this season, I had Bama losing to Michigan 24-20, right? It was 27-20. Michigan could have easily gotten there to 24-20 if they made their field goal and an extra point, and they would have won in regulation at that score. And most of my predictions this year have been, 1 to 3 or 4 points off. So we'll see how that goes. But I like I said, I think I've hammered home enough why I think Michigan wins. It's just where that total reaches is going to be interesting to me, because if Michigan's offense plays at its peak efficiency, they can get up there. I just think it's going to come down to keeping the ball away from Penix.
It could be a razor close game. Michigan could have a 33-30 lead and somebody took Washington in the 4.5 points. And in the last 50 seconds of the game, Michigan ends a drive by kicking a long field goal to try to give themselves, and they win by 6. There's all sorts of equations that make it difficult to navigate a 4.5 point spread for sure. All right. Join Nelson Hubble right there on Maize and Blue Review. Is there anything in particular that you're working on?
Well, I've got my 2 stories this week coming out here. Michigan players to watch and Washington players to watch here for this game. I already gave you guys a tease there on Parker Brailsford and Kenneth Grant, so they'll both be in there. But beyond that, got a couple more players on each side to look at. And I'm looking forward to this matchup. We're going to have our staff predictions, I think, coming out Sunday, so the day before the game. So enjoy it, because it's going to be one for the ages. I think this is going to be a really, really razor close game, and kind of like that Alabama game was this past week.
And folks, as you just heard from Nelson's selections for players at the game and players to watch out for at the Rose Bowl, and he's done this a number of times that he's come on here this season and laid down a few guys. They typically turn out to be the key players. So you want to catch up on that article. Nelson, thank you so much for stopping by.
I appreciate it. Thank you, Mark.